Turns out to be a surprisingly interesting and surprisingly difficult question is how do you define a COPD exacerbation? I once chaired a session at a large national meeting where patients were in attendance, and I was chairing the session on how to define a COPD exacerbation. And after a while, one of the patients, and it changes the complexion of the meeting entirely when people are on their oxygen concentrators and every moment of silence is interrupted by psht, 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 as you hear people getting their oxygen from their conservation devices. But he stood up and said, I have COPD. I've been listening to you guys talk about this, trying to define an exacerbation for the last 45 minutes, and I know when I have an exacerbation. And in fact, that's probably the truth.
There's no generally agreed upon definition of a COPD exacerbation, but they all evolve from the perception by a patient that they have an increase in symptoms and therefore they seek treatment. One definition, for example, enumerates the cardinal symptoms of an exacerbation: shortness of breath, cough and phlegm with an increase in cough and phlegm, and a change in the character of the phlegm. Other definitions require that the patient seek medical care and that they be treated with an increase in bronchodilators or antibiotics or corticosteroids or even hospitalization. And then some definitions require a diary, either on paper or an electronic diary, that measures the extent of intensity and duration of an exacerbation. The most widely used definition, and I think one that's useful for physicians, is that an exacerbation is an increase in respiratory symptoms that persists for 2 days or more beyond the usual day-to-day variation in symptoms and that requires a patient to seek treatment.
A COPD exacerbation is a clinical event where the patients say that they're much worse than they are usually. Now, there's characteristic symptoms. Cough, sputum, dyspnea, and fatigue that are the features of that. And we have created scores to try to use that as an index. We usually define an exacerbation as those symptoms increasing, and then usually increasing enough to require a change in therapy, which is what we use to gauge severity. But all of those are extremely arbitrary. The important point is that exacerbations are times when people with COPD are much, much worse, and there's no other explanation that it's just their underlying COPD being worse. Now, what can make it worse is a variety of causes: infection with viruses or bacteria, or exposure to air pollution, or potentially other things. And probably those exacerbations are all different. So at the present time, a COPD exacerbation is a clinically defined event. It's an event that's meaningful for patients. Our understanding of the biology is really pretty naive, and it's likely that we'll define COPD exacerbations in the future with biological bases in a much more sophisticated way than we currently do.